Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of No, It's Not Just the Weather. I'm Ada, and today with me I have Carlota and Alfredo.
Hi.
Hello.
Today, we're diving into a hotly debated topic: who should be held responsible for climate change, individuals or corporations? Climate change is a global crisis, but the question of accountability often feels murky. Are the lifestyle changes we make on a personal level really having an impact? Or is it the massive emissions from corporations that are driving the crisis?
Exactly, and it's not just a matter of public opinion. There's science and data that we need to look at to really understand what the most effective climate action can be taken. We'll be unpacking some of that today and discussing whether focusing on individual actions is a distraction from the larger issue of corporate responsibility.
Right. And we also need to ask, can corporations actually be trusted to self-regulate? Or are we placing too much faith in them while they continue to damage the environment? Stay with us as we explore the science behind this debate.
Okay, let's start by looking at the scientific side of individual responsibility. The idea of individual carbon footprint became mainstream in the early 2000s, thanks to companies like BP, which promoted the concept. The science here is straightforward. Every activity we engage in, driving a car, flying, even what we eat, adds to our personal carbon emissions.
Yeah, and this makes intuitive sense. Studies show that individual actions can indeed reduce emissions on a small scale. For example, data from the Global Carbon Project shows that personal decisions like cutting down meat consumption or opting for public transport can reduce your carbon footprint by up to 2 tons of CO2 annually. But when you compare that to the 36.8 billion tons of CO2 emitted globally in 2022, that effect seems, pretty minimal.
Yeah, and that's the key issue here. According to a report by Heinrich Boll Stiftung, I hope I didn't butcher his name, while individual efforts are helpful, they are nowhere near enough to combat the scale of the problem. It's more of a symbolic thing than impactful in the grand scheme of things. This report emphasizes that we can't expect individuals to solve a crisis that is largely driven by massive industrial systems.
It's true that individual action is often framed as essential, but from a scientific perspective, the cumulative effect of individual behavior, even if widespread, won't be enough to stop the progression of climate change. The numbers just don't add up when we are talking about emission reductions at a global scale.
And this is where the guilt narrative comes in then. We are told to reduce our plastic use, recycle more, or bike to work, and while those actions are beneficial for reducing waste or improving local air quality, they don't address the root causes of the climate crisis.
Yeah, so now let's zoom out and look at the corporate side of this debate, shall we? There's strong scientific evidence showing that the largest contributions to global emissions come from a relatively small number of companies. We have already talked about this in our podcast. For example, a 2017 report by the Carbon Disclosure Project revealed that 100 corporations are responsible for 71% of global industrial emissions since 1988. This means that a majority of the climate crisis can be traced back to corporate activity, particularly in sectors like fossil fuels, cement production, and large-scale agriculture.
That's staggering.
Yeah.
It puts things into perspective, doesn't it? Well, individuals are told to limit their carbon footprints. Corporations are responsible for the vast majority of emissions. And the science shows that even if a fraction of these emissions were reduced at the corporate level, the impact would be far greater than millions of individuals making lifestyle changes.
Right. And this is where we need to be careful with the narrative.
Okay.
Corporations often engage in what is known as greenwashing. You may have heard the term, but specifically that's where they advertise small sustainable efforts while continuing with harmful practices. Scientific assessments of these companies' environmental claims often show that many are superficial or misinterpreted. A report from the International Energy Agency highlights that despite corporate pledges to reduce emissions, global emissions hit a new high in 2022.
So listening to all this, the question becomes, can corporations really be trusted to deal with climate change? Some argue that corporations should be regulated more strictly, with hard science-backed policies like carbon taxes, caps on emissions, and penalties for greenwashing, for example. These types of top-down measures could force real change, but they're often blocked by the powerful lobbying efforts.
That's where government intervention is crucial. Science shows that without strong regulations, the market alone won't solve the problem. The environmental impact of industries like oil and gas is so large that only policy-driven solutions, supported by scientific data, will lead to significant reductions in emissions.
Precisely. It's not just a matter of trusting corporations to do the right thing, thinking the market will regulate itself. There needs to be a system of accountability and scientific frameworks that can help guide that. The Paris Agreement, for instance, sets specific goals based on climate models, but those targets can only be met if corporations drastically reduce their emissions.
So, listening to all this, where does this leave us? The science is clear that both individuals and corporations contribute to climate change. That's clear. But they do it on vastly different scales. So, should we still encourage individual action, or should the focus shift entirely to corporate responsibility?
Well, the science suggests that individual action, while meaningful on a moral and local level, won't solve the crisis without massive corporate reform. But that doesn't mean we should dismiss individual efforts entirely. Small actions like choosing sustainable products or reducing personal energy consumption can send a message to corporations and policymakers about public demand for change.
Exactly. And when you look at the scientific research on social tipping points, it shows that collective individual actions can influence public policy and corporate behavior. For example, consumer demand for greener products has pushed some corporations to invest more in renewable energy or lower emission production methods. But again, the largest shifts need to come from science-backed regulations targeting corporate emissions.
So ultimately, from what I'm hearing is that we need a balance. From a scientific standpoint, the most impactful change will come from enforcing corporate responsibility. But individuals can still contribute by supporting policies and products that align with long-term sustainability goals. The thing is about pushing for systemic changes while also making informed personal decisions. A great example of this intersection between individual actions and corporate responsibility is CSR, which stands for Corporate Social Responsibility. It is a major topic when it comes to corporate climate action. And to give you some context, it refers to the voluntary steps that corporations take to improve their social and environmental impacts. Many companies promote their CSR efforts and often tie them to sustainability goals. But does it actually make a difference in addressing climate change?
Well, there is a lot of debate about this. From a scientific perspective, CSR is often seen as a double-edged sword. Some studies show that companies implementing genuine CSR practices can lower their environmental impact. For example, CSR initiatives have led to reduced energy use, sustainable sourcing, and better waste management in some industries.
But on the other hand, many critics argue that CSR is mostly PR, a way for companies to present themselves as green without making meaningful changes. Mm-hmm. In fact, research shows that some companies invest in CSR to distract from their core activities, which may continue to be environmentally harmful.
Yeah, exactly. So CSR initiatives should be backed by measurable results. Research from organizations like the Carbon Trust suggests that many CSR programs don't have the scientific rigor needed to make a significant difference. That's why it's crucial for companies to go beyond voluntary initiatives and commit to mandatory emission reductions.
And this is where science-backed regulations come in. While CSR can play a role, the evidence suggests that voluntary corporate action alone won't be enough to tackle climate change. But whether or not CSR should be mandatory or voluntary is a whole other debate. For me personally, I think that we need government policies to enforce stricter guidelines on emissions supported by scientific monitoring of environmental impact.
Right, CSR should be seen as a supplement to, not a replacement for regulatory frameworks. Science supports the idea that real progress in climate action requires a combination of voluntary corporate efforts and legally binding emissions targets.
So, to wrap things up, the science tells us that while individual efforts to reduce carbon footprints are valuable, they won't solve the climate change crisis without significant corporate and governmental action. The largest contributors to global emissions are corporations, and that's where the focus of climate policy needs to be.
Yes, climate action is not about guilt, it's about impact. And the data shows that corporations need to do the heavy lifting if we want to see real progress, but individuals can still play a role in pushing for that change.
Exactly. So, as we leave you today, please remember that the fight against climate change needs to be tackled from all angles. But let's keep the science at the forefront, please, when determining where our energy and focus should go.
So, thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of No, It's Not Just the Weather. Be sure to check the podcast description for the reports and studies we referenced throughout the podcast, and join us next time for more conversation on today's critical issues.
Until next time, stay informed as always, stay engaged. Please keep listening to our coming episodes, subscribe, follow, remember all our socials at No, It's Not Just the Weather.
You can find the links in bio. So,
Yes.
talk
See you
to you
next
next
week.
week. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.